In our last session with Dr. Nolte, we made it to a discussion of Arab nationalism which fueled the wars in 1967 and 1973. Today, we're going to pick up with the negotiated compromises that appear to be directly connected to the compromised security of Israel. Dr. A.J. Nolte is chair of the Government Graduate Program and director of the International Development MA program at Regent University. He is also a member of the Virginia Israel Advisory Board. Dr. Nolte, welcome back to Washington Watch.
It's great to be here again, Tony. I always enjoy these conversations. I wish it was under better circumstances in this case, but I think we can continue to go through the history and really explain, I hope, to people why what is happening now is happening.
Well, and I think it's very important for us to know our history so we might chart a better course forward. Now, on last Thursday, you provided an overview of the establishment of the modern state of Israel, kind of what led up to that. And we left things with you discussing the establishment of Palestinian nationalism. You also said that much of the current situation, and this is where we're going to pick up today, is rooted in the Oslo Accords and the Second Intifada. Can you explain what happened and how that has brought us to this point?
So after 1973, of course, there's a huge shift in the Middle East as the Egyptians decide that the U.S. is a better ally than the Soviet Union. And part of the price of that alliance is normalization with Israel. And that is also something that I think Sadat was genuinely open to himself as well. Having tried the military route, he was now convinced that wasn't going to happen. Previously under Nasser, actually, Egypt and Syria were one country, the United Arab Republic. And so their plan was that they were going to wipe out Israel in 1967, and then the UAR would annex what is the territory of Israel into itself. So there wasn't an idea that there was going to be a separate Palestinian nation. Now, in the late 1970s, of course, you have the Camp David Accords and normalization with Egypt. And this begins a new period in Israeli history. I would say it goes from about 1978 or 79 up through kind of 2000, 2003, 2004, thereabouts. And this is a period in which it seems possible, some are even very optimistic, that there will be a negotiated solution, a good negotiated peace settlement between Israel and the Arab states and Israel and the Palestinians. And sort of the keystone of this in 1994 is the famous Oslo Peace Accord between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. The basic premise here is that the Palestinian Liberation Organization, it was known, the PLO, would be allowed to return to Israeli territory into the West Bank and Gaza, in return for which they would recognize Israel's right to exist and work out a negotiated settlement that would eventually lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state that recognized Israel's right to exist. That was the got to have, right? Recognize Israel's right to exist and force war, terrorism against Israel. Okay, and so you have Oslo opens the ball, and for the next 10 years or so, there is all the shuttle diplomacy. There's kind of a three-way diplomacy between Washington and Tel Aviv and Ramallah, which is the capital of the recognized Palestinian Authority. What ends up happening is in the 1998, which is sort of the second stab at Camp David, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak put a from the Israeli perspective, fairly generous offer on the table that would have ceded 98% of the territory of Gaza and the West Bank to a recognized Palestinian state. The issue that was a hangup was the Temple Mount. But I think that was part of it, and I think that was part of what was irreconcilable, but I think there was also another aspect, and that is this. We talked about the Palestinian identity, and this is a really unfortunate situation. And I preface this by saying that I have the utmost sympathy for the Palestinian people, because I think in many ways they've been victimized by poor political leadership, both at home and abroad. But what you essentially have is a situation in which if the Palestinians ever made peace with Israel, there was a very real sense that they would lose a lot of their international support, particularly the support from the Arab states at the time. They would lose the refugees, would lose the benefits that they were receiving. So the UN Refugee Agency, which you mentioned last time, was paying generously for these refugee populations. And so actually there were some costs to peace on the Palestinian side. And so the Palestinians kept stalling, negotiating. And then eventually, once the Temple Mount was a hang-up, you had what was called the Second Intifada. Now, the reason the Second Intifada is so important is because there was a promise of peace around the corner. Everybody was talking about how peace was about to come. Peace was right around the corner. And then all of a sudden, there are all of these suicide bombings. There are all of these outbreaks of terrorism in Israel. And the Israeli population just realized that Arafat was never going to make a deal. He was never going to actually be a real partner for peace. That was the perception that the Israelis had.
Dr. Nolte, I'm going to push pause for just a moment. We're up against a break, but I want to come back. I know we're going to kind of continue this series over the next couple of weeks, but I want to finish this second point for today, the Second Intifada, because there's a connection there, I think, when you look at the Temple Mount and what triggered that in where we are today. So I want to finish that thought when we come back. So if you'll stick with us for just a few more minutes, we're going to come back from the break, and we're going to continue our conversation. All right, Dr. A.J. Nolte is sticking around. We're going to have a little after-class discussion here. Dr. Nolte, thanks for sticking around. So we left off with the Second Intifada. There was a connection there with the Temple Mount, which we actually saw as being a trigger for what, or at least it was used as such, for what we just saw on October the 7th.
Yes, and to understand that, there's another group. We've been talking about the Palestinian Authority, so let me briefly introduce the other actor in the Palestinian drama, and that is a group called Hamas. Hamas was originally part of a group called the Muslim Brotherhood, and this was a society that was formed in Egypt, and their goal was to spread Islamic government around the Muslim world. The idea being that if you were a Muslim country, you should be governed either directly by Sharia law or by Islamic principles. You could kind of look at the Muslim Brotherhood as, imagine if you took the sort of totalitarian commitment and focus and ideological rigor of communism, and you took out the communist bits and you put in Islam. That's kind of how the Muslim Brotherhood worked. Hamas was a branch of that, and they split off and basically rejected Fatah, because Fatah, which is what became the political party of the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO, because of their negotiation with Israel. They said no negotiations with Israel. Their stated goal was the creation of a caliphate that would embrace all of the territory that was in what is now Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, etc. And so the Temple Mount is a big deal for them because, of course, they say that this is a violation of the sacred space, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is sacred in Islam, the Dome of the Rock. And so having Jews go on the Temple Mount and pray was seen as a violation by them. So they call that the Al-Aqsa Intifada. And Hamas really takes an active role in fomenting revolution and resistance to terrorism against Israel. And of course, the direct connection is that now Hamas, of course, is in charge of Gaza. And say they see one of their goals is the restoration of Islamic sovereignty over that whole area. And by Islamic sovereignty, they don't mean sovereignty of the Muslim people. They mean, and they have translated Islam into what I would describe as sort of a political ideology. That's not necessarily all Islam is like that, but certainly the Islamist movements that come out of the Muslim Brotherhood, that's their approach.
So, Dr. Nolte, there is no peace to be arrived at with Hamas.
No, absolutely not. They are complete rejectionists. The only peace they will actually ultimately accept is the extermination of Israel, and that is in their charter. That is in their covenant. If you read the founding documents of Hamas, they are adamant about that. And so this is important for us to understand. There are a lot of problems with Fatah and with the Palestinian Authority. They tend to be corrupt. Sometimes they can be a bit on the thuggish and authoritarian side, and they will play both sides against the middle, and they're not always reliable. But they're not, in principle, committed to the destruction of the state of Israel. But they often have to play footsie with some of these more extreme groups, or they try to do that to maintain their position in the Palestinian population. But there is a qualitative and quantitative difference between Fatah and Hamas in terms of what they will support and will not support with Israel. Israel can deal with the Palestinian Authority. They can deal with Fatah. Hamas can't be dealt with. And that is one of the things that led to this, is that Israel was kind of hoping that if they just left Hamas alone, left them in charge of Gaza, and kept them from stepping out, that eventually, maybe this would moderate. And the reality is quite the opposite. Hamas has just been using that time to build itself up to attack Israel. They have been compared recently by our government and by the Israelis to ISIS, and that's a very good comparison. And it has become an increasingly good comparison as we've seen the horrific atrocities that they committed on 10/7.
All right, Dr. Nolte, we're going to leave it there for this class period, but we're going to pick it back up and explore further next week this connection between policies, politics, and where we are today in the Middle East. Always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for taking time to join us.
Thanks for having me.